The morning Vivienne Calloway found her suitcase on the front porch, the sun was barely up. It sat there like a verdict. One medium-sized navy bag, the one she'd taken on their honeymoon to Savannah 8 years ago, packed neatly, zipper pulled tight, set directly on top of a sealed envelope. She knew what was in the envelope before she touched it. She knew the way you know bad news before the phone even finishes ringing. She picked it up anyway. Divorce papers, filed 3 days ago. Her husband's signature already on every page, clean and decisive, like he'd been practicing. Vivienne stood on her own front porch in bare feet, holding papers that ended her marriage. And through the kitchen window, she could see them. Christopher, her husband of 8 years, the man she'd built a life with, the man she had loved completely and without reservation. Standing at the counter she'd picked out herself at the Home Depot on Route 9, laughing at something the woman beside him said. The woman had dark hair and wore Vivienne's favorite coffee mug, the ceramic one with the chip on the handle that Vivienne had kept meaning to throw away. His mother, Rosalind, stood in the hallway just behind them, arms folded, watching the window, waiting to see what Vivienne would do. Vivienne did nothing. She picked up her suitcase, walked to her car, and drove away. She didn't cry until she reached the highway, then she couldn't stop. She had been married to Christopher Hale for 8 years, 3 months and 11 days. She had given up a junior partnership at a design firm in Charlotte to follow him to Asheville when he got the position at the hospital. She had redecorated his mother's guest room when Rosalind's hip went bad and she needed somewhere to stay for 6 weeks. 6 weeks that turned into 14 months. She had cooked. She had smiled at holiday dinners. She had swallowed every unkind thing Rosalind ever said to her because Christopher always said his mother didn't mean it, that she was old, that she came from a different time. What Vivienne hadn't known, what she only found out that Tuesday morning in the parking lot of her OB's office, was that she was 11 weeks pregnant. She sat in her car with the little printed confirmation in her lap for a long time. She'd been trying to get pregnant for 2 years. 2 years of ovulation trackers and prenatal vitamins and quiet, grinding hope. And now here it was, finally, precisely when her marriage had apparently already been over. She hadn't told Christopher. When she pulled up to the house and found her suitcase on the steps, she understood, without being told, that whatever she'd been trying to save had been gone for longer than she knew. She drove to the only place she could think of, her college friend Patrice's apartment on the other side of town. Patrice made her tea and didn't say anything terrible and let Vivienne sleep in the pullout for 3 nights before gently pointing out that she needed a plan. The plan Vivienne made was small and practical and survivable. She called her old firm in Charlotte. She accepted a contract position, not the partnership, not yet, but enough. She found a studio apartment with a month-to-month lease on the east side. She told no one about the baby except Patrice and her doctor. She did not tell Christopher. The first time she met Harlan Beckett, she was 7 months pregnant, crouched behind a display table at a charity art auction in downtown Asheville, trying to retrieve a heel she'd lost when it caught on the edge of a display stand. "You look like you need a hand," said a voice from above her. She looked up. A man in his mid-60s, silver-haired, wearing a very genuine amusement, was holding out her shoe. "I look like a beached seal," Vivienne said. "But yes, thank you." He laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and offered his arm while she got to her feet. His name was Harlan Beckett. He was one of the event's major donors, had done something in architecture before he retired, and had apparently spent the last 45 minutes trying to find someone who could tell him anything interesting about the sculpture in the back corner of the room. "Can you?" he asked. Vivienne could. She'd spent 6 years working with a firm that did gallery and museum interiors, and she knew the sculptor's body of work. She talked for 20 minutes. Harlan listened like she was saying something worth hearing. At the end of the evening, he pressed his card into her hand and said his son was looking for an interior designer for a new medical clinic he was opening in Black Mountain. "You'd be doing me a favor," he said. "He has the taste of someone raised by wolves." "You raised him," Vivienne said. Harlan smiled. "Exactly." She called the number on the card 3 days later, mostly because her rent was due, and the contract work had slowed down and she was 7 months pregnant, and had approximately 4 months of savings left if she was careful. She was always careful. She was very, very tired of being careful. The son's name was Bennett Beckett. He answered the phone on the second ring, sounded distracted, said he could meet Thursday at the clinic site in Black Mountain. The clinic was a gutted former hardware store, good bones, terrible lighting, exposed pipe everywhere, a ceiling that didn't know what it wanted to be. Bennett was already inside when she arrived, standing in the middle of what would eventually be the waiting room, squinting at something on his phone. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 38, 39, dark jacket, no tie, the kind of tired that comes from working long hours and not stopping to eat. He looked up when she walked in and did a brief, involuntary double take. Not rude, just surprised. She was very visibly pregnant. "Vivienne Calloway," she said, and held out her hand before he could say anything unhelpful. "Bennett Beckett." He shook it. "My father didn't mention that I'm pregnant?" "No, I imagine he didn't." She looked around the space. "He mentioned you have bad taste." Bennett blinked, then he laughed, and some of the tired came off his face. "He's not wrong." He tucked his phone away. "Okay, walk me through it. What would you do with this place?" She walked him through it. All of it. The lighting plan, the flow, the way the waiting room should feel. Not clinical, not cold, something that made anxious people feel slightly less anxious. She talked about color temperature and acoustics, and the way a well-placed window could change how long a room felt. Bennett asked good questions. Specific, practical questions. He was not a man who nodded and pretended to follow. He actually followed. She got the contract. She had the babies 6 weeks later. Not one baby, 3. Twin boys and a girl. Identical in exactly the ways they were supposed to be. Different in all the ways that made her laugh in the middle of the night when she should have been sleeping. She named them August, Miles. She paused. Miles was on the list. She went with Amos, and the girl she named Fern. Harlan Beckett showed up at the hospital with flowers she hadn't asked for, and the specific, patient presence of a man who understood that someone had just been through something enormous. He sat with her for an hour and didn't need her to be anything other than exhausted. He said he'd called in a favor and arranged for a home nurse 3 days a week for the first 2 months, and when Vivienne started to object, he held up a hand. "You can pay me back by designing my study," he said. "I've hated it for 11 years. She did not cry in front of him. She waited until he left. Bennett came the next day with food from the good Thai place near the clinic and stood in the doorway of her hospital room, looking at the 3 bassinets with an expression she couldn't quite name. "3, he said. 3, she confirmed. He set the food on the table. He sat down. He said nothing for a moment, and then, "Is there anyone? I mean, do you have people?" "Patrice," she said. "And your father, apparently." Bennett nodded slowly. He looked at August, who was making the face that all newborns make, the one that looks like mild philosophical outrage. "He likes you," he said. "My father. He doesn't like most people, I know," Vivienne said. "I like him too." Bennett came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. He said he had questions about the clinic materials, which was sometimes even true. The clinic opened in March. It was genuinely beautiful. A local design blog ran a piece on it. Bennett's practice had a wait list within 6 weeks of opening. Harlan sent Vivienne a bottle of very good champagne and a note that said "I told you so" in his precise, old-fashioned handwriting. By that point, August, Amos and Fern were 4 months old, and Vivienne had moved into a larger apartment, a 2-bedroom with a yard, because Patrice had pointed out that 3 babies and a pull-out couch was a situation with no future. Bennett had helped her move the heavy things and stayed for dinner, and not left until after 10, and somewhere in there it had stopped feeling like contractor and client, and started feeling like something else, something neither of them was saying out loud yet. She still hadn't told Christopher about the babies. This was a decision she'd made carefully. She had spoken to a lawyer. Christopher had not contested the divorce, had signed everything without apparent curiosity about where she'd gone or how she was doing, had moved the woman with the dark hair into the house on Clover Street within 3 weeks of Vivienne leaving. Rosalind had given an interview to the neighborhood Facebook group about how her son had finally found peace. Vivienne had read it once and then blocked the group. Her lawyer advised her to notify Christopher of the children's existence. She understood the obligation. She just wasn't ready. She was getting ready. She was almost there. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning in April, 14 months after she'd found her suitcase on the steps. It came in a cream envelope with a wax seal, an actual wax seal, burgundy, monogrammed, the kind Rosalind would have insisted upon, addressed to Ms. Vivienne Hale, the name she'd legally stopped using 8 months ago. Christopher James Hale and Amber Christine Dubois request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration. There was a handwritten note tucked inside. In Rosalind's careful cursive, we thought you should know he's moved on. You may want to consider doing the same. Vivienne read it twice. She set it on the kitchen counter. August pulled himself to standing using the leg of her chair and made a sound of tremendous personal triumph. Amos was asleep on the mat by the window. Fern was studying her own hand with the intense focus of a scientist. Vivienne picked up her phone and called Bennett. Christopher is getting married, she said when he answered. His mother sent me the invitation. There was a brief silence. To make you feel bad, almost certainly, are you? She looked at her children. August had now sat back down, hard, and was reconsidering his options. No, she said, I'm not. Another silence. Then Bennett said, Do you want to go? She hadn't thought about it consciously, but the answer came out immediately. Yes, okay, he said. Then we'll go. She called her lawyer the next morning and disclosed the children's existence to Christopher's attorney of record. She was told the relevant paperwork would be forwarded. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. She also called Harlan, because she told Harlan most things now. He listened, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, You know, when I was trying to get back into the social world after Margaret died, Bennett's mother, I drove to an event and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes and then drove home again. What made you finally go? Vivienne asked. Bennett called me and said he'd meet me there, Harlan said. Sometimes that's all it is. Someone who says, I'll be there too. The wedding was at a vineyard outside Asheville on a Saturday in late May. Vivienne wore a dress the color of deep water, something between teal and slate, and she had her hair done properly for the first time in over a year, because Patrice had insisted and booked the appointment herself. She left the children with Patrice and Patrice's wife, who had been lobbying for babysitting rights for months. Bennett arrived at her apartment at 11, in a dark gray suit that fit him properly. He looked at her for a moment, in a way that made her feel like she was worth looking at. Ready, he said. No, she said. Let's go. They drove out together. The vineyard was the kind of place that photographed well and tried very hard. White draping on everything, bistro lights, a string quartet playing something that was supposed to feel spontaneous. There were probably 200 guests. Vivienne recognized a handful of people from the neighborhood she'd lived in with Christopher. Couples they'd had to dinner. Friends who had stopped calling after the divorce with the unanimous efficiency of a coordinated retreat. They noticed her. She saw it happen, the small recalibrations, the quiet elbow touches, people murmuring to each other. She had been a footnote in Christopher's story, the first wife who hadn't worked out, the one before. She had expected to feel like a footnote. She did not feel like a footnote. She had Bennett's hand lightly at the small of her back, and she had herself, the version of herself that had found an apartment and a contract and a lawyer, and had grown 3 human beings entirely on her own, and had designed a clinic that a design blog called Quietly Extraordinary. And she walked into that vineyard like it was somewhere she had every right to be, because it was. Christopher saw her from across the reception terrace. He was standing with Amber and a cluster of his hospital colleagues, laughing at something, flushed with the uncomplicated happiness of someone who believed the day was entirely his. And then he looked up and saw Vivienne, and the laugh stopped in the middle. He looked at Bennett. He looked at Vivienne. Something moved across his face. Surprise, recalculation, something she might once have called guilt. Rosalind was beside him, in a silver blue mother-of-the-groom dress, and Vivienne watched her mother-in-law's expression travel from satisfaction to confusion to something harder to name. Vivienne smiled at her. She meant it to be pleasant. She suspected it was not entirely pleasant. She did not approach them. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and found a table with a good view and sat down next to Bennett, who said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The moment came, as she had known it would, about 40 minutes into the reception. Christopher crossed the terrace alone, hands in his pockets, and stopped in front of their table. "Vivienne," he said, "Christopher." He glanced at Bennett with the specific discomfort of a man who has not thought out his entrance. "You came?" "I received an invitation," she said. He cleared his throat. "Right. My mother. She shouldn't have." He stopped. He tried again. "You look well, thank you. I heard you've been working the clinic. Someone mentioned it. I have." He was waiting for her to offer something, some acknowledgement that this was hard, some gesture toward the shared history of 8 years. She understood that. She just didn't have it to give anymore. She had spent it all already in careful increments in rooms he hadn't been in. "Your attorney called mine," Christopher said finally, lowering his voice. "About children, yes. You didn't tell me." "No," she said. "I didn't." You're saying they're mine." "The paternity documentation will confirm it," she said. "My lawyer will be in touch." He stared at her. "Vivienne, congratulations on your marriage, Christopher," she said. "I hope you're very happy." There was nothing in her voice that was cruel. There was nothing that was warm either. It was simply the truth, stated plainly. And she meant it the way you mean things you no longer have a personal stake in. He walked back across the terrace. She watched him reach Rosalind, watched the two of them put their heads together. Amber, his new bride, stood slightly apart, watching with the sharp attention of a woman who was only now beginning to understand what she'd walked into. Bennett said, very quietly, "Are you all right?" "Completely," she said, and she was. That was the strange part. She was completely all right. She felt light in a way that had nothing to do with champagne. What came out over the following weeks did not come from Vivienne. It came from Christopher's own life, which had been conducting itself without her supervision and had arrived at its own reckoning. The hospital's internal review board had opened a preliminary inquiry into Christopher's billing practices. Something about coding errors on a significant number of procedures, the kind of errors that required investigation regardless of intent. Vivienne read about it only because Patrice texted her a link with 3 question marks. Rosalind's planned retirement community purchase fell through when the financing she'd been counting on. A loan from Christopher she hadn't mentioned to Amber before the wedding turned out to be less available than she'd expected. Amber, for her part, moved out of the house on Clover Street 3 months after the wedding. Vivienne knew this only because of Patrice, who knew everyone, who said Amber had told a mutual friend that she hadn't signed up for complications she hadn't been informed about before the ceremony. Vivienne felt no satisfaction in any of it, or rather she felt the mild, clean satisfaction of someone watching a weather system do what weather systems do. She hadn't made any of it happen. It had all been there already, moving toward its own resolution, at its own speed. The thing with Bennett was not fast. It was slow and particular, and it happened in the way of things that are built rather than found, gradually, with attention, by 2 people who were being careful for different reasons. He came to the apartment most Sundays. He learned which of the children would go to him willingly, and which needed more time. August went immediately, delighted by novelty, grabbing at Bennett's collar with both hands. Fern was a study. She watched for 2 months before she allowed him to hold her. Amos came around when he discovered that Bennett could produce a very convincing elephant sound. Harlan visited on Saturdays with increasing frequency and decreasing pretense. He did not pretend he was there to talk about the study renovation anymore. He was there because Fern had developed a preference for him that was difficult to explain and impossible to resist. He brought books. He read to them with the conviction of someone who believed children understood more than they were given credit for. One Saturday in September, Vivienne came back from a grocery run to find Harlan asleep in the armchair with Amos asleep on his chest, and Bennett in the kitchen making something that smelled like it involved garlic and effort. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," Bennett said. He didn't look up from the stove. "You want to set the table, or should I?" She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, holding her grocery bags, looking at this man who had shown up and kept showing up, and had not once asked her to be something other than what she was. She set the table. In October, he asked her if she would like to go to dinner. Just them. Not a work conversation, not a Sunday with the children, just dinner. He said it with the slight stiffness of someone who had rehearsed the phrasing several times and was not fully satisfied with the result. Yes, she said, before he could revise it. They went to a small restaurant on Lexington Avenue she'd been wanting to try, the kind of place with good bread and impractical candles, and no televisions anywhere on the premises. They talked for 3 hours. She could not have summarized what they talked about. She remembered the quality of it, the ease, the specific frequency of being known. He walked her to the door of her apartment, and she turned to say goodnight, and he kissed her, briefly and with intention, and then looked at her in the way he'd looked at her that first morning at the clinic, like he was working something out. Was that all right, he said? Yes, she said. More than. A year later, in the backyard of Harlan's house in Kenilworth, a house that Vivienne had quietly, gradually been reorganizing, because Harlan's study had in fact been deeply unpleasant, and she couldn't leave it that way. August Amos Anfern turned 2 years old. Harlan had made a cake, which was ambitious given that he was not a baker, and it was lopsided and very good. There were balloons. There was a sprinkler, because it was June in North Carolina, and the children were already becoming territorial about sprinklers. Patrice and her wife came with a staggering amount of wrapping paper. Several of Bennett's friends came, people Vivienne had met gradually over the months, and found she liked, which she hadn't expected. Vivienne sat in a lawn chair with a piece of lopsided cake, and watched Harlan chase 3 two-year-olds across the grass with the focused joy of a man who had been handed a second act he didn't know he needed. Bennett sat down next to her with his own plate. He watched his father for a moment. He's different, he said. Since all of this I know, Vivienne said, lighter. I know. Bennett was quiet, then he reached into the pocket of his jacket, which he draped over the back of the chair, and set something on the arm of her lawn chair. A ring, simple, gold, something old about the setting. She would find out later it had been his grandmother's, that Harlan had given it to him the week before and said, if you're asking, use this. I've been trying to find the right time, Bennett said. I don't think there is a right time. I think I just want you. You and them and all of it, whatever that looks like. Vivienne picked up the ring. She turned it over once. Your grandmother's? She said. My father's idea. She looked across the yard at Harlan, who was now on his knees in the grass, pretending to be unable to catch Fern, which Fern found hilarious, and who was absolutely not watching them from the corner of his eye. He was watching them completely, with the unconcealed satisfaction of a man who had been right about something important. Yes, Vivienne said. Obviously yes. The papers arrived from Christopher's attorney 6 weeks later. He had agreed to the paternity arrangement, the support structure, the terms her lawyer had put forward. His own situation had simplified considerably by then. The billing inquiry had concluded without criminal charges, but with requirements that had meaningfully changed the shape of his practice. And Rosalind had found a less expensive retirement community in Hendersonville and appeared to be adjusting. Vivienne signed what needed to be signed and filed what needed to be filed, and then she made dinner in the kitchen of the house on Kenilworth, Harlan's house, hers now too, in the ways that mattered. While Bennett put the children to bed, and Harlan sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and told her about the time he and her late father had gotten genuinely lost hiking in the Smoky and had resolved the situation through a combination of poor map reading and excellent stubbornness. She had found out 3 months after meeting Harlan that he and her father had known each other for the better part of 30 years, 2 men who'd met at a professional conference in Atlanta, and had stayed in touch across careers and cities in the quiet drift of adult life. Her father had died when she was 22, before any of this, before Christopher, before any of the life she'd tried to build and lost and rebuilt. She'd asked Harlan once why he hadn't recognized her name when they met at the auction. Your father always called you Viv, he said, and I hadn't seen a picture in years. You were 12 in the last one he showed me. It shouldn't have made the whole thing feel like something arranged by a force, with better long-term planning than any of them. It did. She listened to Harlan's hiking story and finished making dinner and called into the hallway that food was ready, and Bennett came downstairs with Fern over one shoulder. because Fern had requested to come back down, and August and Amos followed at a run. And the table had 5 places set now, always 5. And the kitchen was loud in the specific way that means something has become a life. Vivienne Calloway, not Hale, never again Hale, just Calloway, the name she'd been born with and was keeping, set the pot on the table and sat down. This was not the life she had planned. It was better than the one she'd planned, in the way that things sometimes are when the plans fall apart completely and leave room for something truer. She had not known. That morning she drove away from Clover Street with a suitcase in the trunk and her hands shaking on the wheel, that she was driving toward anything. She had been, though, she just couldn't see it yet.